not an educational video. How do you cope with your lack of autonomy? How do I cope with the fact that my ambitions will never be realized? Years of my life, our lives, stolen by the bureaucratic hell of school, slowly assimilated into a capitalist machine day by monotonous day, condemned to knowing our futures will be as workers, tools, objects at the whim of capital, condemned to knowing that we have died long before we were even born, a knowledge that only reinforces capitalism. And so we are in this perpetual purgatory, an imitation of death in societal form, a constant series of realizations of how futile our very realizations of our futility are, acknowledging our role in capitalism while acknowledging that acknowledgement itself as capitalistic. We're no longer artists that affect the world. In fact, the concept of humanity does not exist to this system. What kind of person can possibly come to terms with this cruelty? In this new zombie-like totalitarianism, surely we cannot even begin to ask the question. Skip to this timestamp if you just want to get to the video, but if you're just here for information, which isn't really a point of this video, but here we go. Abstract. 1. Politics. Capitalism hates all forms of humanity, including autonomy, arts, and community. Capitalism produces culture, it utilizes addiction as a means of profit, it kills worker motivation, as a recession every 5 seconds, it puts 99% of people in poverty relative to the rich, it relies on constant consumption. Everything about capitalism is irrational. And yet, it still works. A dictatorship is irrational. And yet, the dictator uses it rationally to keep people oppressed. On the surface, it may seem like education produces students. So why then does it overwork them and make them depressed? Education is irrational, but it's actually not. Because education produces workers, not students. Education is capitalistic, and it hates all forms of humanity. That's why it oppresses its students. Students are oppressed through the prison-like design of schools, the productive mindset instilled in us, the grading system, just to name a few. Students are also alienated in this process. Even if schools are reformed to be quote-unquote more humane, it's still under a capitalist system and thus will always have some level of dehumanization. We need to fight for our autonomy and take control of education alongside the means of production. 2. Philosophy. We must imagine change is possible. No matter how dire, we must live for our values. We must be human in an inhuman system. Die on your feet, don't live on your knees. The alternative of self-determination is possible, so we must do what is necessary in the present. Surely, we have no other choice. This is what it means to live. To rebel in any and all societies, even if it means death. And to rebel is to imagine a future, improve our material conditions, and show the masses what is possible. We're building a revolution, not destruction. Autonomy is our right. We cannot live without it. So, in a phrase, I'm saying, give me art or give me death. I do not specify the method for change because many methods work in specific ways, in specific situations, in specific times, etc. etc. I am especially inexperienced in actionable methods of revolution and or protest, so I will not cover that. The channel Anarch has good overview on bringing about change, although not very good opinions on leftist unity, and here's a guide for protesting. I'm just here to cover the philosophy and the theory. Protests are sparked by many factors. See Chile 2019, most recently Palestine protests, stuff like that. Well, as long as there is oppression, I think there will always be movements. And now, for the actual video.
I can hardly remember a time when there was such a thing as a weekend, or when I had a file of facts and I thought about whose name I would add to my address book. I suppose I do my job better, but my job is my whole life. Or my whole life is my job. When I move from calendar to address book to email to text messages.
In the now famous book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher rightfully points out that even realizing the flaws of capitalism is now a cliché. Even the book itself is a cliché. Neoliberalism has created a capitalism so immovable that even some socialists or progressives have given up hope. We have moved beyond the Enlightenment, World War and Cold War eras, where change was so readily possible with revolutions and political turmoil left and right. Now, entering the modern age, we feel a great burden. We look at insurmountable issues like climate change, and we can do nothing but watch as the world burns. Even though history has proven that such doomerism is irrational, even though history has shown that change is possible, more than possible, inevitable, whether it be good or bad. Even as there have been numerous revolutions of past, first liberal ones that abolished monarchy, then socialist ones that abolished liberalism, as well as independence movements that abolished colonialism. Not to mention numerous labor strikes as well, mainly consisting of socialists, that gave us the rights we take for granted today. Child labor laws, 5-day work week, higher pay and shorter hours. The industrial capitalism rebels of the Gilded Age. People had a way of life before the rise of capitalism. Everyday farmers, everyday laborers, craftsmen, they all resisted and persisted, even as they were massacred by an industrial capitalist class. And yet, despite all of this proof, what we see, what we hear is that liberalism reclaimed its former glory in the form of neoliberalism. From colonial genocide to foreign wars of defense and economic imperialism. From the oligarchs of the old Gilded Age to today's billionaires. From slavery to prison labor. From the factories and the mines to the gig economy, Amazon warehouses and immigrant labor. It may seem like that this new capitalism is closer to a Lovecraftian monster than anything real. It may seem like its bounds are undefined and infinitely flexible to disruption. But this neoliberalism is still liberalism. We can still deconstruct it. We can still abolish it. Full-on revolution might not come yet, but we have to do our part for now. Even the Frankfurt School didn't just give up when they saw the failure of the German Revolution. Despite their pessimism, they still attempted to deconstruct society. The future doesn't have to be socialism either. We just have to make sure that isn't liberalism or fascism. The era of capitalist realism, the idea of an immortal, immovable, ultimate power must be ended. This is what it means to be human, to rebel. I rebel, therefore we exist. No matter how seemingly futile rebellion may be, no matter how inhuman, mundane, and indifferent society may be, our chase for humanity, individuality, and creativity, empathy must never cease. Political movements shall always exist. Even the insignificant small reforms like unionizing and changing laws and regulations matter, in that they are a precursor to revolution. We shall stand before the unknowable Goliath, and we shall declare to it, we are accustomed to being catapulted down from the mountaintops into the abyss, but our ship sails its course undeterred and proud, until it reaches its final port, and whether we will still be alive when it is reached, our program will be. His principles will guide the world of humanity after salvation, despite it all. Karl Liebknecht, Trosse Yidam. Last Writings Before Death by Proto-Fascists. Join a movement. Go on strike. Be a person, even if it's only for a brief while. And even if you're forced to repeat it over and over. And if you have a mundane job and you have no time on your hands, still try to live. Maybe unionize, maybe converse about radical ideas. Credit unions and worker cooperatives exist. Buy from local farmers if you can. You don't have to live in some rural commune or community farm. You don't have to be politically active if you aren't in the position to do so. Nobody is obligated. If you're homeless in a desperate situation or other, being human is your best option in my opinion. Live absurdly, write if you can, try not to fucking die, but if you do, die without regret, die with purpose. That is all life is. As for the children, for the students, for the new people of the world, we have a duty that the old generation never finished. Civilization is a giant art project, constantly evolving. Thus, we always have the chance to build something new. As issues slowly mount after the collapse of the USSR, which marks the beginning of the modern age, notably the destructive policies that began with Reagan, the wars in the Middle East, and most recently Israel's genocide. From all of this, we can build something that isn't like the movements of the progressive era, which, according to Robert Cohen in When the Old Left Was Young, had notable Soviet-style flaws such as displaying a penchant for vanguardism, disingenuousness, and secrecy in the way they wielded power. We can build something that isn't like the civil rights movement of the 60s, which was and still is subject to whitewashing by the media. Capitalism has entered its most destructive stage yet, a stage beyond just purely discrimination and the obvious injustices. The modern age is distinct in that oppression is now hidden and disconnected, and yet this also provides an opportunity to create true and lasting socialism. Socialism that cannot even be defeated by the Lovecraftian nature of modern capitalism. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer view the evolution of capitalism as an inevitable dystopia. But, as history has shown, people have a will for justice, a will for their self-preservation rather than capitalism's self-preservation. We aren't just going to stand by and watch as capitalism evolves into totalitarianism. If decline is inevitable, then so too is the fight against that decline. And with all of that being said, let's begin our analysis. First and foremost, we must address a crucially ignored issue: education. Deconstructing society begins with deconstructing education. But today, the issue of education is so overdone, so saturated that it's barely even talked about seriously anymore. It's just something that a politician mentions, something that you joke about, something that journalists use it to get clicks. It's capitalist realism at its finest. Nobody ever talks about the fundamental capitalist nature of education. No, instead we have to talk about how schools are like prisons and how creativity is limited and how terribly unjust all that is. What about the children, am I right? Rarely do I see people talking about education as they do actual prison or healthcare or low wages. People talk about it as part of some kind of imaginary culture war, or otherwise they talk about it in a manner similar to climate change or capitalism as a whole. Something that just shows our futility. Something that's boring because, yeah, we know it's bad, but hey, what you gonna do? We tried telling the politicians to fix things for decades now, and it hasn't worked. We can't establish an entirely new system either. Climate change will kill us before we can. We've known about the issue of education for decades now, and nothing, literally nothing has been done since the Industrial Revolution. After all, we can't really abolish education like we can with prison or police, now can we? We can only reform it, little by little. That's considered a victory. And even that is starting to become more and more unfeasible. Education is an institution so ingrained within our minds, our lives, and our system that we can't possibly imagine the world beyond it. We cannot live without the institution of American education. What would the children do without school? But then, isn't this all of capitalism? Replace students with workers, education with corporation, and now suddenly it's a class struggle. A war that we've been fighting for centuries. Don't let it stop now. Education is just viewed as a period in your life. It's not really all that important. What's important is how low wages are, how ridiculous healthcare is, what job you're going to end up with, how you're going to pay the bills, etc., etc. The oppression of children in school is nullified in this way. After all, you're no longer a child, so why worry about the dehumanization of children? And if you're a parent, well, gotta send your child through school. That's the only way for them to get a job. But this form of parenting is dehumanizing. What if a child wants to be a radical mark? The oppression of children may seem irrelevant to an adult, but change happens with class consciousness first. Change happens when there's enough of will first. And with the utter hopelessness of the indifferent, cold institutions of education, how can we possibly expect change to come anytime soon? Education is class warfare. It is the fight to preserve our humanity. The plight of us students is just as valid as the average worker, for this is our job. We have a prison just as a minimum wage worker does. A prison that divides people between subordinate and authority, teacher and student, manager and worker. When in reality, it's not the manager that's in charge, not the teacher, but the people paying their wages, the fuckers that fund school based on arbitrary scores. Students and workers are also themselves divided as competitors, not comrades. Albert Einstein, in his essay, Why Socialism, says, an exaggerated competitive attitude is inclinated into the student who is trained to worship acquisitive success as a preparation for his future career. The solution to all this would obviously be democracy. Include the will of the people in the institution they're partaking in. Unite the people, be a collective community. However, this is simply impossible under capitalism, and especially under the current education model. Einstein also says in the same essay, the result of these capitalist developments is an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. Though we may have rights on paper, democracy has never really existed. Teachers and workers don't control anything the people paying their wages do. And yet, neoliberalism insists that we have rights. It's not blatantly totalitarian, and that's why it seems so insurmountable today. Though people are more educated than ever, we are only educated in how much life sucks dick. We need blatant examples of cruelty like the Iraq War or was recently Palestine to really look at society, to really want change, to go out there and spit at the police. Compared to larger issues like labor and war, education is especially in the background. It's not blatant exploitation, and people aren't obviously suffering. In fact, people are being quote-unquote educated from this system. I've noticed that some people are incredibly unaware of the world around them, no offense, which is perhaps the most surprising revelation in this entire essay. Some actually think school is great, that work is great. So, let me make it very clear. We live in a violent system. A system that forces us to work at the threat of poverty, of being fired at any time for basically any reason. An invisible gun is at our heads. The exploitation of students and workers needs to be acknowledged on the same level as our endless foreign wars. We cannot just get used to this. Passivity is life-denying. We must continue the fight. That is what it means to be human. And now that I've acknowledged exploitation, perhaps I should begin this essay with a famous work of fiction that is most related. This movie has one thesis, and that is, we're all victims of the modern age. Alex is someone who is in poverty and who is alienated from family. He doesn't have allies, although he runs a gang, which is why he was betrayed in a burglary attempt and subsequently arrested. Spending 2 years in prison, he eventually chose to sign up for human experimentation, allowing him to be free in the matter of weeks. Now, a free man, he finds himself constantly tortured by the unaccepting society. Soon, he was forced by someone he burglarized in the past to commit suicide. He survives. The suicide attempt reversed the effects of the human experimentation, and the government, quick to take advantage of his survival and being hammered by the press about the ethics of human experimentation, tells Alex to clear their name. And with a free Alex and an authoritarian government, a people of passivity in the face of blatant oppression, the movie just kinda ends. The main point being that Alex is now, once again, free. And maybe there's a beauty, a down-to-earth humanity in never addressing the larger societal issues. Instead, just purely focusing on one man's pursuit of autonomy, happiness, and meaning. Alex begins the movie as someone who is enlightened, someone who sees what they are, and someone who becomes what they are. He ends the movie, once again, enlightened. The typical criminal is one who is distinctively human. A type of human who is ruled by their free will, by their dominance of the self. The criminal is romanticized into a rebel in this sense. Though Alex commits atrocious acts, he is joyful in committing these acts, and he has the choice whether to commit an act or not. Alex has autonomy, Not full autonomy, but certainly a considerable amount of it. Alex is the romanticized criminal, one who is defined by nothing but themselves, someone who commits crime not because of any environmental forces like poverty, though that certainly plays a role, but because of a will to power. In an age of passivity and oppression, there the criminal stands, as a beacon of life, seemingly not oppressed, and definitely not passive. On the other hand, the civilized criminals view this autonomy, this sacred rebellious humanity, as an obstacle, as an error to be corrected. In this sense, the civilized criminal is defined by a distinctive lack of humanity, perhaps even a hatred of it. They view humanity as something to be manufactured, manipulated, and fitted into arbitrary categories of good or bad. Their goal is not to help the criminal. Their goal is to keep society running, to mold people like Alex into a cog, and in pursuit of these goals, they view basic human morality as, quote, the higher ethics, turning instead to utilitarianism, the ends justifying the means. This fucked up, alienated way of thinking leads them to justify human experimentation, forcing Alex to feel sick whenever he thinks of a criminal act, thereby fully removing his autonomy, removing everything that makes him human. He's no longer good nor evil. He's now just passive. The priest tries to speak reason to the scientists, but what he doesn't understand is that good and evil died a long time ago. His arguments are worthless in the face of modernity. The civilized criminal is defined by the autonomy of the other. They live to make cogs out of humans. But the civilized criminal is defined by vengeance as well. Because their goal is not to help human beings, they simply lock them up. The uncivilized causes suffering to the civilized, and in turn, the civilized causes suffering to the uncivilized. Be it criminals or civilians, what's the difference? Both cause unnecessary suffering, and both have a choice whether to do it or not. The policeman who brutalizes others, the civilians who are cruel to the criminals, are no less corrupt than the criminals themselves. And this cycle of suffering makes one thing very clear, and that is, we're all victims of the modern age. If the movie humanizes uncivilized criminals as a will to power, logically, we must then also humanize the civilized criminals as a will to power. The only difference between the two is that the latter is a reaction to the uncivilized criminal's will to power. This question of autonomy and humanity is at the core of my essay. But there's one thing I like to critique this movie on, and that is the subject of human connection. What is also essential to our humanity alongside autonomy is the act of living for others. Humans are naturally social, but in this movie, Alex runs his gang like a authoritarian, with him being at the top and the rest at the bottom. What this movie could have done better, perhaps, is portray the alienation of modern society that makes Alex run this gang like this. For example, in Joker 2019, Arthur doesn't really care about anyone other than himself because he's in a shit situation and nobody cares about him either. That's the type of social commentary that this movie lacks. Otherwise, it's just a blatantly false betrayal of humans. Humans don't naturally form hierarchies like this. We form communities. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. The modern age is the exception. And with that in mind, let us now ask the fundamental question. What is the modern age?